writer, kind of, because I'm a journalist by profession. But since Hugo Bergmann is an important part of history of this city that I consider to be my home, I would like to pay just a small piece of debt that we have to him, because I think to a high extent it was forgotten during the 20th century, Czechoslovakia, and I believe that this conference is also part of repaying the debt to such a huge native of Prague. Do you hear me well? Okay, thank you. I think that we can say that Hugo Bergmann had so now I'm perfectly symmetrical. This will represent my energy. I think Hugo Bergmann had kind of three lives. One of his life is the one that he spent in Prague from his birth in 1883 till the moment that he left Europe in 1920. Because in 1920 he began a completely new kind of life in Jerusalem. And it turned out that this other life was much longer, because he spent another 55 years in Jerusalem. The third life would be life after he was dead, because I think in many parts of the world he was perceived in different ways. And even today, when you look at diverse materials, sometimes Hugo Bergmann is referred to as fellow student of Franz Kafka. Sometimes he is mentioned as one of those who frequented Berta Fanta's literary salon, and so on. So I would also rehabilitate Hugo Bergmann as someone who was active in Prague as a Zionist activist, but also as a thinker. I will not go very much deep into his philosophy. I'm certainly not qualified for that. While writing this paper, I was using different materials. Hugo Bergmann himself wrote a kind of short memories of his childhood and early age. Also, his brother authored texts of this kind. His mother, his wife, and some other relatives. So this can be used as a source. I also invited many years ago National Archives here in Prague that store some documents, especially from the police directorate of Prague, where you can find, for example, his passports. He kept his Czechoslovak citizenship in 1920s at least. He used the Czechoslovak passport. He had to renew it and so on. And of course, last but not least, I was using literature of more eminent historians who are dealing with this stuff. Many of them are probably present in this room. Unfortunately, I didn't have opportunity to study Bergmann's papers that are stored in Jerusalem. As I mentioned, as you know, Hugo Bergmann was born in 1883 in Prague. He had an older brother, Arthur, 2 years older, who became lawyer, and he became an important collaborator of Hugo Bergmann during his Prague years. Bergmann's parents were Johanna and Zygmunt Bergmanns. The family stayed first in Jindřišská Street and then in Dušní, so very close to this area. Generally, the whole life of Hugo Bergmann, as long as he was in Prague, was located somewhere very close to this area. He, as far as I know, he never lived, for example, in Vinohrady or Karlín, two very Jewish parts of Prague at that time. Hugo Bergmann was, however, the first generation that lived in Prague, which can be important for some reasons, for different reasons. His ancestors on both sides came from the area near Příbram, which is which was almost 100% Czech-speaking area, bordering between central and southern Bohemia. Again, important, thank you very much, important detail of his life that can have some meaning for his later years. And like many other Jews living in this area, he attended German language schools. The same applies to university studies. He first studied chemistry together with Franz Kafka. Both of them left, and Bergmann decided to study philosophy, again at the German part of the university here in Prague. In 1906, he began his job as a librarian at the university library, and although he is remembered for other things, being librarian became part of his mission and profession during the rest of his Prague years, and also at the beginning of his Jerusalem years as well. In 1907, he married Else Fanta, a woman from living at the Old Town Square. Again, like we are very close to that place. They had 2 children. Martin Bergmann was born 1913, I guess. His sister Eva was born 2 years later. Martin Bergmann later became very eminent psychotherapist in New York, because although he spent his childhood first in Prague and in Palestine, Martin Bergmann later resettled to New York. As a matter of curiosity, you can see Martin Bergmann speaking in Woody Allen's movie, Crimes and Misdemeanors. He plays a psychotherapist speaking about the importance of love in human life. It's a movie from 1989. Martin Bergmann died in 2014 when he was 100 and almost 1 year. So he was even like, his longevity was even longer than his father's. I have no information about Eva Bergmann. I don't know what happened to her. So Hugo Bergmann, as I mentioned, is not remembered as a librarian, first of all, but as an intellectual and a Zionist activist. He was a member of a small circle of German-speaking intellectuals. Again, these are like things that should be mentioned, at least that he was part of this circle that used to meet at Luba Cafe. If you visit today Luba Cafe in Prague, they mentioned Kafka, Einstein, and some Chopin as those who frequented the place. They should add Hugo Bergmann as well. However, the circle later moved to literary salon of Berta Kafka, who went to the Old Town Square. So this environment is also part of his biography. This is how Max Fanta, Berta Fanta's son, and Hugo's brother-in-law, described the atmosphere in the meetings. In the year before the war, a small circle of philosophically interested men used together to study idealistic philosophy. Hugo Bergmann was the intellectual head. My mother was the linking and enlivening, I'm sure how to pronounce it, element. Felix Welch was the analytic thinker. Max always brought stimulating ideas. Not only were Kant, Fichte, and Hegel examined word by word, but some of the more speculative ideas. It's interesting that Max Fanta doesn't mention anything Jewish, anything Zionist whatsoever. Either it was not debated, or for Max Fanta it didn't play any role in his life. I think Bergmann's philosophical work should be treated separately. I think it could also give some better understanding of his life at that time. For sure, he was dealing with ideas that he perceived as opposing. He dealt with religion and rationalism, activity and contemplation and so on. I think he was a man who was like a very calm. He was known for being very, very rational person, but at the same time, his philosophical topics show that he was involved in like a very wild mental world as well. He was very practical thinker as well. because he was involved in politics, although he did not think of himself as a political Zionist. He simply wanted to deal with the problem of the Jews of his time, which means at the turn of the century, in a very wild era of this country, especially in the late 1990s. Many things were happening. In 1894, you had Dreyfus affair. In 1899, you had Hilsner affair here. In 1897, it was Badenese reforms that collapsed. Anti-Semitic riots followed, and so on. All this made the atmosphere within which he came to his Zionism, and within which he thought that Zionism, and especially establishing Jewish identity as a separate national identity, is a solution to this problem. Of course, I should have mentioned that in 1895, Herzl's Judenstaat was published, and 2 years later, the first Zionist Congress took place in Switzerland. However, for Bergmann, being a Zionist was not a kind of revolt against his family's background. Both of his parents were convinced Zionist before he finished his gymnasium. His older brother was a Zionist. His uncle was a Zionist. So, in fact, Hugo Bergmann grew up in the Zionist milieu, if one may say so. Of course, most of those who deal with Bergmann as a Zionist, they concentrate on his time he spent in the Bar Kochba Jewish Students' Union. He was first member, then a chairman between 1901 and 1905. And this is how also his Zionism was reflected on this Bar Kochbian kind of Zionism, because he brought in some important ideas, especially the conviction that Jews should first undergo a kind of spiritual and inner renewal, and only then they can solve other problems. To some extent, it can be mirrored by what was going on in the Czech environment, because also many of the Czech nationalists of the 19th century believed that first the Czech need to reborn themselves, if one may say so, and only then they can search for a political solution. So this was Bergmann's version of the cultural Zionism. It was him who brought in these ideas, such as texts of Achat Ha'am or some other thinkers that promoted this kind of Zionist ideology. It was also him who brought in Martin Buber, who came 3 times to Prague. I think this is a story that is quite well known. Again, Bergmann was the one who built some bridges between his environment and the Czech realists. First of all, Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk. Probably it was him who informed Masaryk about Achat Ha'am. Masaryk, in his articles about Zionism from that time, mentions Achat Ha'am, and it looks very interested in what Achat Ha'am had to say about the solution to the Jewish problem, but maybe to the Czech problem as well. I think the primary fear of Hugo Bergmann at that time was that the Jews were caught in the middle of the two nationalisms, the Czech one and the German one. His main idea was to take the Jews out of this conflict, of this clash, and for this he used the idea that the Jews are a separate nation, so neither the Germans nor the Czechs should claim Jews for their purposes, because the Jews had their own things to solve in this particular time. I think it has also a very important impact for his kind of Zionism that he practiced later in Palestine, because again, he had an experience when he traveled to Galicia in 1903. He saw that while the Czech Jews are caught between the Germans and Czechs, in Galicia he found out that the Jews there are caught between the Poles and the Ukrainians, and he thought that this was like an impossible situation, that the Jews must need to step out from these conflicts. And when he moved to Palestine, and that's already another life of his, he thought that the solution to the problem of Palestine is, of the future Palestine, is that a binational state should be built there, which is something that was not accomplished here, because by birth of Czechoslovakia, although built by Masaryk, who was Bergmann's intellectual hero to some extent, it was a collapse of the idea that every nation should find a solution together with the other nations. In his famous essay, Javne und Jerusalem, he puts it like this: the trial by fire of the truly Jewish character of our settlement in Palestine will be our relationship to the Arabs. This is what he wrote about the task of Zionism before World War I. And that's why he came to establish the Shalom in Jerusalem, and with the idea that the binational state in Palestine should be built. He was obviously a remarkable man, but in many ways he was more than remarkable. He didn't quite fit into the categories of his era. First of all, yes, he attended the German schools, he spoke German at home. Probably when he had dreams, he had dreams in German, we will know, of course. But I think he was like a more than typical bilingual Jew, more than that. Sorry, I skipped something. First of all, I think he didn't fit socially into the environment. Why? Because almost everyone else around him, Franz Kafka, Max Brod, Felix Welch, his own wife, they came from middle class or upper middle class environment. He himself came from a rather poor family. They were still members of the middle German-speaking Jewish middle class. But if you look at the way they lived, what kind of apartments they had, what kind of means they had for their purposes, he didn't belong to the same social level as his environment. Even in his old age, he remembered that Kafka, not only that he had his own working table, but he had his own room. For Bergmann, it was something that he couldn't imagine, because they lived in a little apartment, which was sometimes even rented out to other people just to spare money. So socially, he did not belong to his environment. At least he was not a typical representative of that. I spoke about the language. As far as we can judge, the everyday language of his family was German, language of communication in Kafka's family and other families of his environment. But I think his relationship with Czech language, or his bilingualism, was of a different kind. If you look at some of the family papers, you see that his family must have been very Czech-speaking. His mother attended Czech school in South Bohemia. When she referred to her husband Sigmund, she referred to him as Mundíček, not Sigmund or Sigi, whatever, Mundíček, and so on. Sometimes her name was Johanna, sometimes she's referred to as Jana, and so on. So, in fact, Bergmann must have had much more intimate relationship with the Czech language. Also, it is documented excuse me, by himself, because he spent large part of his summer holidays in South Bohemia, in Příbram, in the area around, especially in Chraštice. Again, he was like immersed in the Czech environment. So while for Igor Kiš or Franz Kafka, Czechs were just people around, and they could communicate with them in Czech because they learned Czech in the street. for Bergmann, Czech language was his own language. That's also probably why he promoted the idea that Bakohba should be bilingual student union, which was very unusual for that time. As for the languages, I think it makes sense to mention that, again, for many Jews of his class and environment, Hebrew was something very exotic. Bergmann learned Hebrew fluently, he used Hebrew, he was able to give speeches in Hebrew, he was able to write in Hebrew, and he had no problem to resettle in Palestine, not only because he spoke English, and he also learned Arabic, also because his Hebrew was fluent. But again, it was very unusual in that, because what we can judge from the family papers, there were some other family members who spoke fluent Hebrew, like his grandfather was a fluent Hebrew speaker even before Herzl became a Zionist. After all, Herzl never spoke Hebrew himself. So again, like linguistically, Bergmann did not fit into the categories of his time and place. The same applies to religion, and I'm coming close to the end. His relationship with Judaism was complicated. I think it would deserve some more thorough study, more thoroughly minded that I can give you here. But for sure, his relationship with Judaism was again much more intimate and much firmer than what we can find in his environment. And even those Jews, like those middle-class German-speaking Jews who found some intimate relationship with Judaism, in order to accomplish that, they had to go to the east. Here it's well-known story of Jiří Georg, who traveled to Galicia, where he became a kind of Hasid. Franz Rosenzweig, famous philosopher, he became devout Jew right before his conversion to Christianity, because he traveled to Galicia. And many, like Franz again, like an example for him, like more what instigated his interest in Judaism was meeting of the Yiddish theater in Prague. However, for Bergmann, it was very different. In Bergmann's case, it was a different story, because for him, Judaism was the thing that he observed in his own family in the countryside. Just a short quotation from his own papers. When we came to Chraštice, which is the place where his uncle's family was living, it's the area near Příbram. When we came to Chraštice, where our father was born, suddenly the whole Jewish atmosphere was different from Prague. It was just here that my uncle's house, where I could directly grasp the type of Jewish atmosphere with my hands. This way of living and the strong Jewish awareness made an extremely great impression on us Praguers, which means he and his brother, especially the Shabbats. This Shabbat in the village had considerably more Jewish content than a Shabbat in the modern Jerusalem. Modern Jerusalem means 1960s in history. I myself came to a positive Jewish attitude, in fact, a real love for Judaism, in a small Czech village in which only 2 Jewish families lived. Again, neither Hebrew nor Judaism were an exotic thing for him as a Central European Jew. He had it from his own environment. This was part of his roots. And he had very intimate relationship with that. Again, I can quote here like passages from famous Kafka's letter to his father, where Kafka complains about lack of the Jewish atmosphere in Kafka's family. So you can put these 2 texts together, like side by side, and see that these are 2 different stories about Central European German-speaking Jew and their religious outlook. And maybe the last thing that I wanted to stress, where he was unusual, he thought of himself as a cultural Zionist, which means that he preferred cultural, spiritual renewal of the Jews. He didn't look for a political solution, first of all, unlike Herzl and unlike many Jews who became Zionists here in Prague. However, he was so different from so many of these cultural Zionists. He really did travel to Jerusalem. He really did build an infrastructure there. He built a library later. He built the university. So he didn't behave as a cultural Zionist. He behaved as a practical or political Zionist, unlike many others who spoke about Zionism, but never left Prague, or left Prague only when it was really necessary. Max Brod left with the last train in 1938 or 9. Hugo Bergmann's brother Arthur also left only in late 30s. Martin Buber is an intellectual hero. When Bergmann suggested to him that they should travel to Palestine after World War I, Martin Buber complained that his Hebrew is not sufficient and never left, or left only after Hitler came to power. So, okay, Hugo Bergmann was a cultural Zionist on surface, but inside I see him as like a very political, practical Zionist, although, of course, we would again find a lot of differences from the other political Zionists in Central Europe of his time. Okay, I said that I will speak about his first life, which finished more or less in 1919, maybe in 1914 already, because in 1914 he was drafted to the army. He spent a large part of the war in Galicia and later in Hungary. He was injured. His mother-in-law, Berta Fanta, who was like a rich and influential woman, who was in kind of love with her son-in-law. She used her connections to get him out from the front and made it possible for him to spend the rest of the war in Vienna. So he didn't live in Prague. Later he became activist, Zionist activist here again. Again decided after the well-known things that he traveled to Paris to represent Jews at the Paris conference after World War I. For several months he became director of the cultural section of the Zionist organization in London. But however, he never planned to settle in comfortable Europe for the rest of his life. Maybe you know the joke that who is a Zionist? Zionist is a Jew who uses money of another Jew to send another Jew to Palestine. It was not his case. He really meant it. He wanted to move to Palestine already in 1911. World War I prevented him from doing that. But once it was possible, in May 1920, he moved to Jerusalem. He settled there. He spent the next 55 years there, and thus he began another life of Hugo Bergmann, a life of Shmuel Bergmann in Jerusalem, which is not the topic of my speech. So this is more or less all I wanted to say. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward for any disagreements with my paper, or certainly I'm looking forward for other papers that are going to follow. Thank you very much.